The National Desk, America's News Now. Developing as we come on the air, debt ceiling talks break down. With just days to go before the U.S. could default on its debts, negotiators go into the weekend pointing fingers.
We've got to get movement out of the White House, and we don't have any movement. So, yeah, we're going to pause.
Then a growing field. The candidate announcing a bid for the White House today as a still unannounced 2024 presidential hopeful touts achievements that critics call overreach.
So we just completed what I would say is the boldest and most far-reaching agenda that we've seen in the modern history of the Republican Party.
And the NFL loses an icon. One of the greatest to ever grace the gridiron has passed. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Eugene Ramirez. Beware, everyone. Default back on the table right now as Republican negotiators are stepping back as they say discussions have become, quote, unreasonable at this point. Congressman Garrett Graves, picked by Speaker Kevin McCarthy to lead these talks, told reporters today, quote, it's time to press pause because it's just not productive. It seems spending levels are the holdup, as Speaker McCarthy said this morning.
The White House is just... Look, we can't be spending more money next year. We have to spend less than we spent the year before. It's pretty easy.
Well, the White House has said that the Republicans are holding the economy hostage over that issue, and there are two separate issues, the budget and the debt ceiling. And after the talks broke up, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries responded via Twitter, blaming the conservative fringe for this breakdown. Wages are up, inflation is down, and more than 12 million good-paying jobs have been created during the Biden presidency. Right-wing extremists are again threatening to default and blow up this progress right now. America must always pay our bills. That was their reaction. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen held a private meeting with Wall Street bankers and repeated her dire warnings that the country's default ex-date still remains early June, if not by June 1st, 13 days from now. U.S. Treasury surpassed the $31.4 trillion debt limit this year on January 19th, but the Treasury Department has been using what's known as extraordinary measures, basically accounting gimmicks, to fully finance government operations. The ex-date is the exact time when those measures become impossible and then necessary payments don't get made if a deal isn't reached. But is the ex-date deadline truly June 1st? Well, take a look here. The Bipartisan Policy Center projections do agree that the ex-date could be as early as June 1st, but also as late as August. The federal government receives new tax payments on a quarterly basis, and the next due date is June 15th. Represented by this bump that you see here, if there hasn't been a default by then, the Treasury could buy some extra time. So what do you think Congress should do right now? Well, in the latest AP NORC poll just out today, 63% of those polled believe the debt limit should be raised as long as it's tied to spending cuts. Only 19% want to raise the limit without conditions, known as a clean bill, which is what President Biden wanted, saying that the Democrats would take up the spending cuts as a separate issue after coming to an agreement on the debt ceiling. Now, amazingly, 16% believe that the debt limit, I shouldn't say amazingly, 16% believe the debt limit shouldn't be raised at all. G7 summit continues today. It's just after 7 a.m. Saturday in Hiroshima, Japan right now. And early today for us, last night for them, the G7 leaders issued their vision of nuclear disarmament. In part, it reads, we underscore the importance of the 77-year record of non-use of nuclear weapons, Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, undermining of arms control regimes, and stated intent to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus are dangerous and unacceptable. Now, this followed the president and G7 leaders unveiling a new round of sanctions against Moscow. Nearly 300 new sanctions will be placed upon individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft. As many as 70 companies could be blacklisted for selling restricted U.S. products to Russia. Other G7 nations are expected to announce similar sanctions over the weekend, and Britain announced a ban of Russian diamonds into the United Kingdom. Well, before President Biden makes his way back to the U.S. after the meeting concludes Sunday, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky will attend the summit in person. Zelensky was originally expected to attend the meeting virtually, and he's using the opportunity to rally more support for his country. Now, this comes as the Biden administration reveals it overestimated the cost of support to Ukraine by $3 billion. Meaning that the Pentagon spent $3 billion less than originally thought. Now, to date, the Pentagon says that it's committed just over $30 billion in security assistance to Ukraine to fight against the Russian invasion. A national debate over the use of preferred pronouns has landed at the steps of the State Department. Janae Bowens takes a deeper look into the controversial practice that's hit the nation's capital.
A passionate exchange at Thursday's State Department press briefing.
It's ridiculous.
Associated Press reporter Matt Lee said the State Department had begun adding pronouns to all of their employees' email profiles, and some of them were wrong.
This is not an optional thing. This is something that has been just arbitrarily imposed.
A spokesperson for the department was unaware of the change.
I have not seen this phenomenon for myself.
The State Department's Matthew Miller later tweeting it was an issue with Microsoft Outlook, and the change was unintentional. This being discussed at a federal level as pronoun policies and laws are being looked at across the country.
It's not worth risking one life.
In Arizona, State Representative Lorena Austin, the legislature's first non-binary lawmaker, says a bill forbidding teachers from using students' preferred pronouns without parental permission is hateful.
We heard so much testimony from people in this community, from young people who were told that if they ever came out, they would be harmed, in some cases even killed.
Proponents of the bill say parents have the right to know what is going on with their child.
The struggles they're going through and not create an alternate reality for them at school while they go home and live a false reality with their parents.
Tennessee Governor Bill Lee signed a bill Wednesday that protects teachers if they refuse to refer to students by their preferred pronouns if it is not consistent with the student's biological sex. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, there's a proposal to make the willful use of the incorrect name or pronouns of an individual unlawful across various sectors, including education.
Now, the State Department tells me they were testing a new feature that accidentally went live. Now, they say they regret the confusion and tell me it won't be mandatory when they do roll it out, an effort they say to make their systems more inclusive.
More inclusive, but that comes amid what many are calling Republican attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now here we have more ammo for that culture war. But Janae, right now Microsoft is expanding pronoun options to more of its programs like Teams, for example. What do Americans make of technology-related pronoun policies in the private sector?
Well, Eugene, a recent poll from Newsweek shows the majority of millennials are in favor of workplaces requiring gender pronouns on emails, while close to 50% of Gen Z respondents are opposed to the idea.
And the millennials right now are the majority of the workforce, so keep that in mind. Janae Bowens in Washington, thanks so much. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton just announced an investigation into gender transitioning procedures or gender-affirming care on minors at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. Now, this comes less than a month after he announced a similar investigation into Dell Children's Medical Center in Austin. He stated, quote, "I am committed to investigating any entity in our state to ensure that our children are protected, though many unhinged activists," he says, are compromising the healthcare field, think otherwise. Children are not to be treated as science experiments. Well, these medical institutions, including the American Medical Association, says that it's the governments that are making medical decisions without the proper knowledge. Now, Paxton says a request issued to the hospital will identify if any state laws have been broken. Following the crime surge across America, police saying that the shooting at a General Motors engine factory in Ohio was sparked by a feud over a woman. Authorities say a man shot his co-worker at the D-Max plant last night before shooting himself in the head. 28-year-old Jeffrey James Allen III was pronounced dead at the scene. Police say the shooter underwent surgery and remains in the hospital. They have not released his identity. A third employee was also hurt, but police believe Allen was the target of that attack. Officials say the woman that the men were fighting over, the women, excuse me, that the men were fighting over, also works at that plant, but is not clear right now if she was there at the time of that shooting. According to police, the suspect fired more than 12 rounds from a handgun. A California dermatologist has pleaded not guilty to accusations that she tried to poison her husband. 46-year-old Emily Yu is facing 3 felony counts of poisoning and 1 felony count of domestic battery with corporal injury. Prosecutors say she was caught on camera putting liquid drain cleaner in her husband's lemonade. Yu's lawyer says that she was mixing drain cleaner with lemonade to bait and kill ants in the kitchen. If Yu's convicted, though, she could face more than 8 years in prison. We're now learning that children's book author Corey Richens is accused of taking out a nearly $2 million life insurance policy on her husband, Eric Richens. The 33-year-old Corey is charged with aggravated murder of her husband and 3 counts of possession of a controlled substance. Eric was found unresponsive in their home near Salt Lake City, Utah on March 4th of last year and died of a fentanyl overdose. And opioid overdose deaths right now skyrocketing across the country, and yet one of the most effective treatments for addiction remains vastly underprescribed. The National Desk's Angela Brown has more on this Addicted America.
We are talking about addiction treatment medications like Suboxone. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that between 2016 and 2019, only around 20% of patients with opioid use disorder actually filled prescriptions to treat their addiction. The opioid crisis is killing Americans at record numbers. Public health experts are now advocating for greater harm reduction.
Harm reduction is a set of priorities, principles, practices that seek to reduce the harm associated with using drugs and policies that lessen the impact of communities impacted by drug use.
One of the most life-saving treatments, Suboxone. It works to reduce cravings and painful withdrawals. This study found Suboxone reduces the risk of an overdose by 50%. But not enough people get the medication.
It's estimated that only 20% of people that have opioid use disorder have prescriptions for opioid medication.
One major player, federal policy. Last year, Congress expanded access to buprenorphine, resulting in about 7% of clinicians being cleared to prescribe it to a limited number of patients.
Access increases when there's no restriction to prescribing. But still, the legacy of having that restricted access is that clinicians are less likely to be trained.
Suboxone use also has stark demographic differences. One study analyzed 11 million addiction medication prescriptions filled between 2006 and 2020 and found 8.1% of patients were Black, 6.3% were Hispanic, and 84.1% were white.
You want to think about, equity. The system, it works for some people and it doesn't work for others quite as well.
The CDC says since the pandemic began, 13% of Americans had reported increasing or starting substance use as a way of coping with stress. In Washington, D.C., I'm Angela Brown.
Right now, child marriage survivors and others are pushing for Michigan's minimum marriage age to be 18. Survivors shared their stories with lawmakers at Michigan's State Capitol building. Michigan law says a 16 or 17-year-old can get married with a parent's approval. Children under 16 can get married with a judge's permission, and there's no minimum age in the state. The nonprofit Unchained at Last estimates that more than 5,000 children were married in Michigan from the year 2000 to 2021. Still to come here on the National Desk, we're going to tell you what the Fed chair said today about the future of interest rates. Will they keep going up? And as the 2024 presidential race gets closer, the Republican field growing today. We're going to reveal the latest person to make it official. Then why a school memo about gender identity is sparking some controversy and drawing national attention. We're back in 90 seconds. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was in New Hampshire today for the second time in recent weeks. New Hampshire holds the first primary and the second contest after the Iowa caucuses. DeSantis enjoys the endorsements of 51 New Hampshire GOP state lawmakers right now. Sitting with some legislators, he took a possible dig at the current polling that favors Donald Trump.
It's easy to be a front runner. It's easy to go out and take positions that are really popular at the time. It's harder to dig in and really cut against the grain. Not going to be easy, but I honestly believe that we have an opportunity to right the ship and to get this whole country going.
Well, as we wait for Ron DeSantis to announce, or perhaps not announce, that he's running for president, it's not stopping South Carolina Senator Tim Scott from entering that race. The Senate's only black Republican filing paperwork today to run for president of the United States. Scott branding himself as an optimistic candidate who avoids partisan brawling and grievance-based politics. Spent Monday in his hometown of North Charleston. To your money now. Earlier today, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell sharing some insight on the future of interest rates. He said rates might not need to increase as much as expected to reduce inflation because of stress to the banking sector.
So as a result, our policy rate may not need to rise as much as it would have otherwise to achieve our goals. Of course, the extent of that is highly uncertain.
He explained that this is because tighter credit conditions are affecting economic growth, hiring, and inflation. Frustrations building now as Colombians search for answers in a plane crash in the Amazon. An incredible story here. This plane went down in the jungle on May 1st. Colombia's president saying that 4 children were found alive, then took back the statement because he says it could not be confirmed at this time. Officials say it has been difficult to communicate with search parties there in the jungle. The country's General Director of Civil Aviation Authority says that 3 bodies have been recovered so far, 2 adults from an indigenous community and the pilot of the plane. Some of the indigenous community now accusing the government of negligence in the deaths. Rescuers are still searching for those missing children, and the Civil Aviation Authority says their hopes, quote, remain intact. The deadly outbreak of drug-resistant bacteria connected to an eye drop recall continues to spread. According to the CDC, 81 cases and 4 deaths have now been reported across the United States. The FDA has been warning Americans not to use 2 brands of eye drops, Delsem Pharma and Ezracare. The CDC says most of these new cases involve people using the recalled brands or living in nursing homes with people with previously diagnosed infections. Well, get this, a new study finds that New York City is sinking under the weight of all of its skyscrapers. The research from Earth's Future Journal finds that the Big Apple is sinking 1 to 2 millimeters per year. Now, in some areas, it's double that rate. Well, it's not very much, right? 1 to 2 millimeters. The researchers say that it shows coastal high-rises could increase flood risk thanks to sea level rise. Now, this study calculates all of New York City's structures' weight, a total of 1.68 trillion pounds there in Manhattan. A search going on right now for 2 construction workers missing after a major construction fire broke out in Charlotte, North Carolina yesterday. The Charlotte Fire Department saying that the search process can be lengthy because of the extensive structural damage, and added that they cannot confirm loss of life at this time. We're going to bring you updates as we learn them here at the National Desk. In Kansas now, health officials warning people to stay inside because of a fire at a recycling facility in Kansas City. They say the smoke could possibly affect air quality in the area. The National Weather Service said the rain could help reduce the smoke in the air. A cause for the fire unknown at this moment, and the EPA is on the scene measuring air quality. We'll continue watching any developments there as well. Across the country, there's a new kind of land grab happening right now, and it might surprise you. Millions of acres are being bought up by foreign investors, including those from one of our biggest adversaries, China. No state is more impacted in this than Texas, where Scott Thuman reports for Full Measure.
Southwest Texas. Out past the oil derricks and cattle ranches, as you approach the Mexican border, you find scrubby ground that's hard to work. But even in a place the locals call the middle of nowhere, land is in high demand, like these 140,000 acres bought in 2018 by a billionaire from America's #1 international rival. The Chinese real estate tycoon who bought it for millions of dollars said he wanted to build giant wind turbines to sell power to the Texas grid.
I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong that any country that is an adversary of the United States should have the right to buy anything in the United States.
As a direct result of the wind power plan, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a law preventing other nations and companies of certain hostile countries from owning or having access to the state's critical infrastructure, including the power grid. Still, some think Texas needs to go further. Republican Senator Lois Kolkhorst pushed a new, stricter law banning anyone from countries the U.S. identifies in its national threat assessment, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and yes, China, from buying any Texas property.
This is about protecting our homeland and saying that, Texas is a strategic state in our nation, and that we need to hit the pause button and make sure that we know what's going on.
18 states currently have some form of restrictions for foreign ownership of land, but the rules and penalties vary widely. In Washington, a committee on foreign investment, known as CFIUS, reviews and can block foreign purchases and investments, but it doesn't have jurisdiction over all property deals.
It concerns me long term because if we do wind up in a war with China, for whatever reason, and they control our supply chain, they control our food chain, they control our electrical chain, all they got to do is flip a switch, and America's in trouble.
Now more states are considering restrictions on foreign ownership of land, and there are calls for the federal government to do a much better job of tracking exactly who owns what. For Full Measure, I'm Scott Thuman.
Check out this week's all-new Full Measure Sunday and look for Full Measure After Hours wherever you get your podcasts. Some sad news to report out of the NFL. The Cleveland Brown great Jim Brown has passed. For many who saw the all-but unstoppable running back play, he was the greatest NFL player to play the game. He retired in his prime after the 1965 season and became a vocal leader in the Black Power movement. He also became an actor, and he starred in more than 30 films. Jim Brown was 87 years old. We'll be back in 90 seconds. And we're back now, taking the pulse of America, starting with a growing trend of build-to-rent homes.
It's a different living experience than it would be living in a multifamily apartment.
That different living experience is what Austin Calvin is discovering in his neighborhood at the Trails at Culebra.
They have a lot of workers working, cutting the grass. They cut the grass every 2 weeks.
Apartment life is a thing of the past for the 27-year-old. He moved from his 1,300 square foot apartment on Ingram Road to this brand new 1,700 square foot build-to-rent home with his son and fiance. David Veneziano, executive vice president for Tricon Residential, says 173 military families like Calvin's have moved into their build-to-rent homes in San Antonio.
Really not much to distinguish between the home where our residents may live as renters versus their neighbors that own. They're all part of the same community. The kids go to the same schools, and that's part of the appeal.
This is the headline on Fox News.
Cincinnati schools told to consider reporting child abuse if parents unsupportive of child's gender identity. Today, CPS leaders adamantly refute the article, saying, quote, it's filled with inaccuracies and misleading inferences about the district to support their article narrative. Here's what's causing the back and forth. These are the minutes from the Board of Education on September 13th, 2021. During a discussion on a report from the Policy and Equity Commission, there's a section on transgender students. It says, quote, special consideration should be given by schools about disclosing a student's gender identity to parents. This information should not be shared with parents if it puts a student at risk of harm at home. In that case, the administrator should also consider whether there is a mandatory duty to report child abuse to 241 kids.
This is an alley where Bellingham Police Lieutenant Claudia Murphy says fentanyl use and overdoses happen regularly.
The only thing left was just empty packets of Narcan. Everybody was just right back to doing what they were doing. It was just it's very eerie feeling.
But she says users aren't afraid of the cops.
You saw the one guy already gripe at us or gripe at me for driving through.
Or the consequences of using deadly fentanyl.
Of course people need treatment. But until we have that infrastructure in place, we are left with nothing. And so that's what our officers are struggling with.
City data shows first responders here in Bellingham have responded to 300 overdose calls this year. Of those, 42 patients were under the age of 20.
We're back in 90 seconds. The 148th running of the Preakness Stakes, the second leg of the coveted Triple Crown, is happening tomorrow just outside Baltimore. But the field will be small, only 7 horses. This morning, First Mission was scratched after a veterinary exam. Kentucky Derby winner Madge remains overall favorite to win the 8-5 odds. Join me again tonight at 10 p.m. and get updates all around the clock on thenationaldesk.com. Thanks so much for watching.